Transport of carbon dioxide occurs between the tissues to the lungs. Carbon dioxide is produced via the process of cellular respiration at all the tissues in the body. The big toe is no exception. I tend to use the big toe only because it is the tissue that is farthest away from the lungs. Certainly, it's not the most metabolically active tissue. Nonetheless, it still serves its purpose. CO2 is transported to the lungs three ways. One, directly in the blood plasma. While it's not super soluble in fluid, it's certainly much more soluble than oxygen is. 7% of CO2 is transported directly in the blood plasma from the tissue to the lungs. The second way is bound to hemoglobin. We will look at that. The third way is in the form of bicarbonate. The main form of transport for CO2 is in the form of bicarbonate. So 7% remains in the blood plasma, 93% enters the red blood cell. And the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to have CO2 binding to hemoglobin. Now I have CO2 here and CO2 here and CO2 here, all in different colors, just so we can follow these CO2, where they go and how they eventually get to the lungs. CO2 certainly is CO2 wherever it is. I'm just trying to show the pathway of this. Another thing I want to point out, I've got numbers on some of these steps, but at some point my numbers get off. So please disregard these numbers until we get to the very last slide where all my numbers are well coordinated. Nonetheless, 23% of this CO2 that enters the red blood cell is going to bind to hemoglobin. To be clear, it is not binding to the heme group that oxygen binds to. It's not binding to the iron atom. It has its own binding site on the hemoglobin molecule. While that 23% binds to hemoglobin, the remaining CO2, which is the majority, is going to react with water that's inside the cell, create carbonic acid, which I haven't shown here, and that's going to immediately dissociate into the hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. Then what we're going to have is hemoglobin is going to function as a chemical buffer against this hydrogen ion. And we've talked about chemical buffers in previous videos. Earlier in the semester, the phosphate ion can act as a chemical buffer, hemoglobin can act as a chemical buffer, and bicarbonate also acts as a chemical buffer. Bicarbonate's not going to buffer this hydrogen ion here because it's going to be much more valuable moving into the blood plasma. This whole pink region within these slides is the blood plasma. Keep in mind, blood is primarily composed of the plasma and the red blood cells. These black circles are representing the red blood cells where hemoglobin resides. So in this step right here, we're going to have the hydrogen ion binding to hemoglobin at the same time that this CO2 is bound to hemoglobin. And then bicarbonate is going to lead the cell to function as a chemical buffer in the plasma. It leaves the cell via the process known as the chloride shift. Bicarbonate leaves in exchange for chloride, which comes into the cell, which is going to help maintain the charge of the cell. And we're going to look like this now. Once again, it's maintaining the charge of the cell because we have this positively charged hydrogen ion here. Chloride comes in to neutralize the cell. Then we still have this plasma CO2, which once it gets to the lungs, it is going to move down its partial pressure gradient into the lungs and then get exhaled from the lungs. That is the first CO2 that's leaving our system. Now that that CO2 has left, this CO2 on hemoglobin is going to have a reduced binding affinity because it wants to move down its partial pressure gradients into the blood plasma. And that's exactly what it does. The orange CO2 unbinds from hemoglobin, moves into the blood plasma where there's a lower partial pressure of CO2, and then immediately moves into the lungs where there's even yet a lower partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And then that CO2 is exhaled. So now what we're left with is hemoglobin. Once this CO2 leaves this hemoglobin, the hydrogen ion pops off of hemoglobin because now the hydrogen ion has a reduced binding affinity for hemoglobin. As a result, bicarbonate is going to move back into the cell via the process known as the reverse chloride shift. Bicarbonate is going to come in to grab this hydrogen ion. When bicarbonate comes in, it's being exchanged for chloride. If chloride didn't leave, the electrical voltage of the cell would be out of balance. Then what we're left with here, the chloride has left. This hydrogen ion reacts with the bicarbonate that just came into the cell. That's going to create carbonic acid, which I'm not showing here. And the carbonic acid will dissociate into water and CO2. That CO2 will proceed to move down its partial pressure gradient into the plasma, then into the lungs, and get exhaled. That is transport of CO2. I have these steps numbered 1, 2, 3, all the way through 8. So take a look at that, please. The numbers are not super important. I've just tried to make it more seamless in following the process. The transport of CO2 is certainly more complicated than the transport of oxygen, but there it is for you.